What's up, y'all? Today I'll be talking about a really fascinating book that wrote extensively about the Korean Peninsula's history. I found that the textbook, A History of Korea, third edition by Kyungmun Hwang, was available on Audible. So I gave it a listen and it was awesome. Check it out. Go diving a little bit into some things that really stood out to me. First and foremost, I find it interesting the way that I think you could argue that Poland and Korea have really similar histories. They're trapped between competing rivals, just trapped in that dynamic that embodies a sphere of influence. And one thing that I hadn't heard extensively about before reading this book was it talked about the slavery system, which used to operate in Korea, that was at its peak during the Joseon dynasty. It ended in the late 1800s, so kind of coincidentally around the same time that slavery in the United States ended. And tons of the enslaved adopted the already popular surnames of their former masters, which is part of the reason that Korea mainly has three surnames: Kim, Park, and Uri. And this book talked about how since slavery at that time wasn't based on race, Korea back then and today is an extremely homogenous population. Slavery's more or less become an afterthought in the history of Korea, especially in South Korea or the Republic of Korea. In some sense, it was a little easier to overcome, unlike the United States, where sadly the institution of slavery in the United States had everything to do with race, and in that sense, it never really goes away and will always be a stain on our early legacy. Whereas in Korea, the former enslaved could more seamlessly over time just blend back into society. That said, this book also talked about how for North Korea, perhaps you could even argue that part of the reason that North Korea is so totalitarian and has so much control over its population is because that they more or less just replicated the already existing slavery system that had been there. I never really thought about that, but I found that pretty profound, pretty fascinating. This book also talked at length about the Japanese colonial era, which lasted for roughly 40 years, and it brought up a lot of points that I had not ever really thought about, that had not been brought to my attention. And I thought I'd share them here. Of course, I still recommend listening or reading this book, but hopefully this can be a catalyst for that. So, nobody really wants to admit it, but South Korea's government, especially in the early days, had its roots in the Japanese colonial era. When U.S. forces arrived in 1945 and had to govern South Korea, they didn't have much to work with, so they pretty much just integrated the already existing governing apparatus into the new government that was eventually officially established. And within that government were a number of Japanese imperial holdouts, or as we'd probably refer to them as collaborators. And as a result, the South Korean government more or less was just a carbon copy of the Japanese imperial government that had been there for decades. I'm probably oversimplifying a tiny bit, and again, with the language barrier, I'm not as well versed. I'm sure there might be some things that could be missing that are more properly documented in the Korean language that haven't been translated into English yet. But this really does go to show that South Korea in the early days had its roots in Japan. And even a number of South Korea's early military figures during the Korean War had formerly been in the Japanese imperial military in some form. And one of their most prominent dictators or presidents was Park Chung-hee, and he'd formerly also been a member of Japan's military during World War II. And today, especially, South Korea's government more consistently calls out former historical collaborators that worked with the Japanese and is often requesting apologies and reparations in some form from the Japanese government. But when you consider more of the entire historical context, in some sense that could be considered pretty hypocritical, since the early components of South Korea's government were taken directly from the old Japanese system. And I thought that was very unexpected. I did not know about that kind of thing. But now that I think about it, it makes a lot more sense. When I had the opportunity to visit South Korea, study abroad at the War Memorial there, it talked about how a number of Japanese youth volunteered to go fight to defend South Korea during the Korean War. And I remember reading that and thinking, I wonder why. That seems kind of out of left field. And now I realize that a huge part of the reason that many of those young Japanese did so was because, from their perspective, when they were repelling the communist invasion, they were really more defending Japan's colonial reputation and legacy, since they felt like South Korea was one of the last remnants of Imperial Japan's influence. Just for the record, I think that probably it could be a bit more productive if we try and be a little more understanding of the context in which these people were collaborating. Especially by the 40s, most people living in Korea at that point, it had been decades of imperial rule by Japan, and for all they knew, Japan was not going anywhere. The very rapid and unexpected conclusion to World War II on the Japanese front caught everyone by surprise. And all these so-called collaborators, they were just doing their best to maybe get by in an impossible situation. That doesn't excuse everything that happened, but we need to remember that history is not a judicial procedure per se. It's more a quest for understanding. And from that same line of thinking, it would probably be more productive if the South Korean government today could acknowledge that, and if they want to criticize, then they should probably put an equal effort to criticize their own people that collaborated, not just throw all the blame at Japan. But that's my hot take on all of that. Wow. Everything is much more complicated when you look into it more, and much more layered. And another thing too, with regards to the whole reparation or apology side of things, for Park Chung-hee, when he was leading South Korea, he made official diplomatic ties with Japan, and though that infuriated many South Koreans, opening up trade and relations with Japan, their neighbor that's right next door, that certainly helped contribute to South Korea's economic miracle. And from the Japanese government's perspective, and perhaps from Park Chung-hee's perspective, he felt that Japanese contributions to South Korea's incredible economic growth at that time was a form of reparation per se, or recompensation for the hardships that Korea endured during the imperial era. So now, all these years later, when South Korea's government repeatedly says it wants an apology or reparations, a lot of Japanese in their government can't help but feel frustrated because they feel like they more or less already made up for what Korea endured. And to top it off, that they still may view that South Korea is still a lasting remnant of Japan's imperial era, especially during the early time. So I found all of that very. I'm so glad I read this book. It really informed me a lot on more of the history of part of the world that I'd already been to, but now I find it all the more interesting. What a layered and complicated relationship continues in Asia and particularly in the Korean Peninsula. So I highly recommend reading this book. And I'm going to give this, I know it's just a textbook, but wow, talk about a good one. That's a rare thing. I'm going to give this book an A.